For 20 years, I was his shadow. He called me perfect, but he meant powerless. He thought his billions bought my soul. But while he was busy counting his money, I was counting his lies. By the time I'm done, he won't just lose his wealth, he'll lose his mind. Our mansion, a sprawling masterpiece of marble and glass on the edge of the cliffs, was less of a home and more of a museum. And in that museum, I was the main exhibit, Mark's most prized acquisition, polished, presentable, and silent. For years, my identity was entirely absorbed into his. I was the wife of Mark Sterling, the billionaire developer, the man who shaped the city skyline, and the man who thought everything in the world had a price tag. Our life was a symphony of staged perfection. From the charity galas to the private dinners, I played the role of the adoring wife with award-winning precision. I smiled when he made jokes at my expense. I nodded when he made decisions that affected my life, and I became an expert in the art of being invisible in plain sight. But behind the closed doors of our master suite, the glamour was just a thin, brittle coating over a foundation of absolute control. Mark didn't just love power, he was intoxicated by it, and he used his financial dominance over me like a weapon to enforce obedience. He dictated what I wore, who I could call, and even what I was allowed to eat at dinner. Any form of dissent was met with a cold, terrifying silence that could last for weeks. "You're lucky I found you, Elena," he would sneer, usually after one of his multi-million-dollar deals had gone through. "Without me, you'd be nobody, remember that." It was a psychological prison, and the bars were made of his immense wealth and my supposed dependency. I watched my friends drift away, unable to tolerate the suffocating atmosphere Mark created, until the only voice I heard was his. I became a shell, a carefully composed facade of a person, my own desires and thoughts buried deep beneath layers of obligation. He had successfully convinced the world, and almost me, that I was disposable, a decorative object that he could replace whenever he grew bored. But inside that decorative object, a tiny, resilient spark was still burning, waiting for the one mistake a narcissist always makes, the moment they believe their own lie. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday evening, a night that started like any other, filled with the predictable rhythm of Mark's self-importance. Mark was in his study, the doors slightly ajar, a rare lapse in his obsession with privacy that I hadn't noticed until I approached with his nightly scotch. I stopped just outside the heavy oak door when I heard his voice, not in its usual booming command, but in a low, frantic whisper I had never heard before. He was talking to Victor, his business partner, and for the first time in 20 years, Mark sounded afraid. "We can't let the audit happen, Victor," Mark hissed into the phone, the ice in his glass clinking nervously. "If they look too closely at the offshore accounts, the whole house of cards collapses." I stood frozen in the hallway, the tray trembling in my hands as the word collapse echoed in my mind. He went on to describe a web of deceit so complex it made my head spin. Tax evasion, forged signatures, and millions of dollars moved through shell companies I recognized from our tax returns. In that moment, the man I thought was an invincible titan was revealed to be a desperate criminal, hiding behind a curtain of stolen wealth. But it was what he said next that truly shattered the last remnants of my loyalty. "If it comes to it, we'll pin the primary signatures on Elena," Mark said, his voice now cold and clinical again. "She's the one who signed the household trust documents. She's the perfect scapegoat." I felt a wave of nausea hit me, a physical reaction to the realization that the man I had sacrificed my life for was planning to sacrifice my freedom to save his own. I didn't enter the room. I turned around silently, my footsteps muffled by the thick hallway carpet, and retreated back into the shadows of the mansion. That night, as I lay in bed next to a man who was preparing to send me to prison, I didn't cry. The fear that had kept me trapped for 2 decades was suddenly replaced by a cold, sharp clarity that cut through the fog of my dependency. I realized that Mark's greatest weakness wasn't his illegal dealings. It was his absolute certainty that I was too stupid to understand them. He had spent years making me feel invisible, but now that invisibility was going to be the very thing that allowed me to destroy him. The golden cage was still there, but for the first time I saw that the lock was on the inside, and I was the one holding the key. I closed my eyes not to sleep, but to begin drafting the first move of a game Mark Sterling didn't even know he was playing. The next morning, I woke up before the alarm, my mind already vibrating with the precision of a master clock. I watched Mark sleep, his face looking old and tired in the gray morning light, and I felt nothing. No anger, no hate, just a cold, clinical detachment. When he finally opened his eyes, I was standing there with his coffee, wearing the same vacant, submissive smile I had worn for 20 years. I played the role of the worried, slightly dim-witted wife to perfection, asking him for extra household funds because I had accidentally overspent on a new charity event dress. Mark scoffed, his ego instantly stroked by my apparent financial incompetence. "You really are a disaster with money, Elena," he muttered, reaching for his briefcase and scribbling a signature on a series of blank checks for the household trust. He didn't even look at the papers as he handed them over, convinced that I was just signing for groceries and curtains. He didn't realize that among those household papers were authorization forms for the very offshore accounts he had whispered about the night before. As soon as he left for the office, the invisible wife disappeared. I grabbed my coat and drove to a small, nondescript library on the other side of the city, far from the eyes of Mark's social circle. That's where I met Sophia, my childhood friend who had become one of the sharpest forensic accountants in the country. We hadn't spoken in years because of Mark's isolation tactics, but when I showed her the copies of the documents I had accidentally found, her face went pale. "Elena, this isn't just tax evasion," Sophia whispered, her eyes darting across the complicated spreadsheets. "This is a massive fraud scheme, and he's right. If this goes down, you're the one holding the smoking gun." I looked her straight in the eye, the hollow shell of a woman finally filled with a lethal purpose. "Then help me turn that gun around, Sophia. I don't want a divorce. I want a hostile takeover of his entire life." For the next few weeks, I became a ghost in my own home. While Mark spent his evenings at expensive clubs, celebrating his genius with his cronies, I was up late in the dark, scanning every document in his safe and sending encrypted files to Sophia. I learned to intercept his mail, to listen to his phone calls from the other room while vacuuming, and to slowly move small amounts of money out of the trust into a private account Sophia had set up for me. Every time Mark insulted me or called me useless, I simply smiled and thanked him. I was feeding his narcissism, making him feel so safe and so superior that he stopped even trying to hide his tracks from me. I was no longer just a victim of the trap. I was the one building a new one, brick by digital brick. Mark Sterling thought he was a predator in a world of prey, but he was about to learn that the most dangerous animal is the one you think you've already broken. The air in the mansion had grown thick with a tension only I could feel, like the moment before a skyscraper finally gives way to its own weight. Mark had become increasingly erratic, his phone ringing at all hours of the night, his face twisted in a permanent mask of suppressed panic as the federal audit drew closer. I knew he was getting ready to throw me under the bus, so I decided to give him the perfect opportunity to do it. During dinner, I intentionally let a fake document slip from my purse, a poorly forged bank statement that made it look like I was the one hiding money from him. He pounced on it like a shark sensing blood in the water. The next morning, without a word of warning, I was served with divorce papers in the middle of our breakfast room, delivered by a man who looked more like a bodyguard than a legal server. Mark stood by the window, his back to me, looking out at the cliffs with a cold, triumphant posture. "I've known for a long time, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with a fake theatrical sadness. "I know about the accounts you've been hiding. I know you've been stealing from the household trust." I sat there, frozen, playing the part of the blindsided victim perfectly. I let my hand shake as I picked up the papers, which stated that because of my fraudulent activities, I would receive absolutely nothing from the divorce. No alimony, no property, and no protection. "You have 2 hours to pack a single suitcase," he sneered, finally turning to face me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "By noon, the locks will be changed and the police will be notified of your embezzlement. You wanted to play with the big boys, Elena. Now you can pay the price in a cell." He walked over and snatched the expensive diamond necklace from my neck, a gesture so petty and cruel it almost made me laugh. He thought he had just executed the perfect crime, pinning his years of corporate fraud on a greedy, confused wife. As I walked up the grand staircase for the last time, I heard him laughing downstairs, calling Victor to tell him that the problem had been solved. He thought he was watching me leave in defeat, but he didn't notice that I wasn't carrying a suitcase of clothes. I was carrying a small encrypted hard drive tucked into the lining of my coat, the result of 2 years of silent auditing. While he was busy celebrating his brilliance, He didn't realize that the divorce papers he had just served me were the very things that gave me legal standing to move against his assets. I walked out the front door without looking back, the cold wind from the ocean hitting my face like a long-awaited blessing. I wasn't a victim being exiled. I was a commander moving to the final battle station. I drove straight to Sophia's office, where a team of federal investigators was already waiting. Mark Sterling had spent 20 years teaching me how to be invisible, but he was about to find out that the most dangerous enemy is the one you never bother to look at. 2 hours later, the locks on the Cliffside mansion were indeed changed, but it wasn't the police who arrived to arrest me. It was a fleet of black SUVs belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and they weren't there for the confused wife. Mark was sitting in his study, a glass of 30-year-old scotch in his hand, savoring the silence of his victory, when the front doors were kicked open. He didn't even have time to stand up before the agents flooded the room, their weapons drawn and their warrants held high. "What is the meaning of this?" Mark bellowed, his face turning a deep, angry purple. "I'm the one who called you. I have the evidence of my wife's embezzlement right here." The lead agent didn't even look at the folder Mark was waving. Instead, he stepped aside to reveal me standing in the doorway. I wasn't wearing the submissive neutral colors he had forced on me for 2 decades. I was in a sharp, midnight blue power suit, my eyes cold and steady. "Actually, Mark," I said, my voice echoing in the marble hallway, "the only evidence they care about is the data I've been sending them for the last 6 months." I walked over to his desk, the desk where he had signed my supposed death warrant just hours before, and I placed my smartphone down. Every offshore account, every forged signature, every bribe you paid to Victor, it's all there, categorized and time-stamped by one of the best forensic accountants in the country. The look on Mark's face wasn't just fear. It was the absolute soul-crushing realization that he had been outmaneuvered by someone he considered a decorative object. You couldn't have," he stammered, his hands shaking so violently the scotch spilled onto his expensive rug. "You don't even know how to use the computer, Elena." I leaned in close, my face inches from his, so he could see the spark he had tried so hard to extinguish. "I've known how to use everything for 20 years, Mark. I just knew that as long as you thought I was a fool, you'd keep leaving your secrets right where I could find them." As they handcuffed him and led him out of the house he had turned into my prison, he looked back at me, his eyes pleading for a mercy I no longer possessed. He lost his companies, his reputation, and his freedom in a single afternoon. The house of cards had finally collapsed, just as he had feared. Because of the evidence I provided, the courts ruled that all of Mark's assets, the mansion, the accounts, the developer empire, were to be seized and placed under my control as the primary whistleblower. The disposable wife didn't just walk away with half, she walked away with everything. That evening, I stood on the cliffside balcony alone, watching the sun set over the ocean, the same view Mark used to claim he owned. I took the diamond necklace he had snatched from me earlier, which the police had returned, and I dropped it into the dark waves below. I wasn't the shadow anymore, I was the sun. The golden cage was gone, and as I walked back into the mansion, I realized that the greatest power in the world isn't money or status. It's the silence of a woman who is finally done waiting for her turn. Mark Sterling had spent his life building a skyline, but I was the one who finally learned how to fly.